May 6th, 1988. Burbank, California. Crystal Spencer, a 28-year-old aspiring actress working as a topless dancer, phones her sister and mentions that she is feeling ill. No one hears from Crystal after this, and 1 week later, her decomposing body is discovered in a corner in her apartment. She is nude from the waist down, entangled in her telephone cord, and the coroner is unable to determine her cause of death. However, neighbors report having heard screams from Crystal's apartment, and her boyfriend notices odd discrepancies in her autopsy report, which makes him suspect that she was a victim of foul play. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to explore a pretty strange case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the unexplained 1988 death of Crystal Spencer. It's the story of a small-town girl who moved to Hollywood with aspirations of becoming an actress, but wound up coming to a tragic end. However, the exact circumstances of what actually happened to her are a big mystery. All anyone knows is that Crystal was found dead inside her apartment 1 week after she was last heard from, but her body was so decomposed by this point that no one was able to determine how she died. It's possible that she simply succumbed to an unknown illness, but there are enough bizarre elements in this story to suggest she may have actually been the victim of foul play. Crystal's biggest advocate has been her boyfriend, Anton Klein, who is quite a unique character himself, and has pushed forward the theory that Crystal was murdered, with the potential perpetrator being a former police officer who became a murder victim himself less than 1 year later. But we'll delve into that in a little while and try to determine the most likely explanation for Crystal Spencer's bizarre death. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is now on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards such as stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unexplained death of Crystal Spencer. Our story begins in Burbank, California in 1988. Our central figure is 28-year-old Crystal Spencer, who originally hails from the small Northern California town of Ukiah. Like many young women, Crystal dreamed of becoming a famous actress and left home to make the move to Los Angeles in 1982. Unfortunately, Crystal had little success finding much acting work, so in order to pay the bills, she took a job as a topless dancer at the Wild Goose, a club located near Los Angeles International Airport. The job paid decent money, and Crystal could take home hundreds of dollars in tips every night, but as the years passed, her attempts at an acting career never went anywhere, as the only jobs she was able to procure were 2 small roles in television commercials. In May of 1987, Crystal became involved in a relationship with Anton Klein, a PhD candidate in history who was attempting to find success as a screenwriter. Even though Anton was nearly a decade older than Crystal, and they came from different backgrounds, the two of them hit it off. According to Anton, he helped broaden Crystal's cultural horizons by introducing her to the world of museums, art galleries, and classical music. However, Crystal would not tell Anton about her job as a topless dancer, and he only found out about it 4 months into the relationship after a friend of his happened to see Crystal on stage at the Wild Goose. Even though Anton was not happy about Crystal's profession, he knew that it was helping her make ends meet, and he accepted it. The couple's relationship continued on for a year, until Anton stopped by Crystal's apartment in Burbank on May 4th, 1988. Crystal was sick with the flu, but she had some important news. She was being considered for a potential job opportunity in Japan. The 3-month gig would involve working as a hostess girl at a Japanese nightclub, but even though Crystal was nervous about the idea of living abroad, she was determined to go for it. In fact, she had made an entry in her journal around this time period, which read, quote, "I feel stuck. I'm going to get unstuck. God guide me. Get me out of the wild goose by the end of May." End quote. After Anton left Crystal's apartment, they spoke on the phone again the following night, and she told him she was feeling much better. On May 6th, Crystal had a telephone conversation with her sister Julie. At the time, their mother was renting temporary quarters from a family in Los Angeles, and Crystal asked for her phone number. According to Julie, her mother had told her to only use it in the event of an emergency, and since Crystal had a tendency to talk people's ear off on the phone, Julie pretended she did not have the number. Crystal responded by saying she was really sick and could hardly make it to the bathroom, but Julie figured she was just being overdramatic and refused to give out the number. Their call soon ended, but this would turn out to be the last time Crystal was confirmed to be alive. According to Anton, the next time he tried to contact Crystal was on May 8th, but after calling her number multiple times, he kept getting a busy signal. He contacted the operator, who told him that Crystal's phone was off the hook. This did not concern Anton too much, since Crystal was a very disorganized person who had a tendency to leave her phone off the hook after she finished a call. Anton then spoke to the doorman at the Wild Goose to ask if anyone had seen Crystal, and he was told she hadn't worked there for a couple days because she had left for Japan. Anton figured that Crystal had already left to start a new job without saying goodbye, and even though he found that unusual, he believed she would soon call him from Japan. Well, on May 13th, which incidentally happened to be Friday the 13th, neighbors from Crystal's building started complaining about a foul odor coming from her apartment, so the police were notified. When they went inside, they discovered Crystal's body. She was resting in a corner, nude from the waist down, and dressed only in a red shirt. Her body was entangled in her telephone's cord, but there were no records of any calls from her apartment since she last talked to her sister on May 6th. By this point, the body was in an advanced state of decomposition, which seemed to indicate that Crystal had been dead several days before she was found. There were no signs of any forced entry, and while the apartment was in a state of disarray with belongings scattered everywhere, Crystal was not an orderly person, and her place was often a mess anyway, so this did not prove that a struggle had taken place. When an autopsy was performed, there were only slight traces of alcohol and marijuana found in Crystal's system. There was no indication that she might have committed suicide, but there were no signs of trauma or assault on her body either. In the end, while the authorities were inclined to think that Crystal died of natural causes or some sort of unknown illness, the Los Angeles County coroner could not figure out what killed her and officially ruled her cause of death to be undetermined. On several occasions, Crystal's family requested to view her body, but was told by the coroner's office that it was in no condition to be seen. In spite of this, her family was given the impression that Crystal was the tragic victim of a fatal illness and had no reason to believe anything was amiss. Crystal's body would soon be cremated, and her friends and family held a private memorial service in which her ashes were scattered beneath the Hollywood sign. However, Anton would soon uncover information which led him to believe that Crystal may have been murdered. It turned out that at around 4 a.m. on the morning of May 7th, 2 of Crystal's neighbors, who lived downstairs beneath her apartment, were awoken by what sounded like a woman screaming. The neighbors were Jet Taylor, yes, that is his real name, and his fiancée, Susan Aiken, who also happened to be somewhat famous herself, as she was a former Miss Mississippi who won the Miss America pageant in 1986. The couple believed that the screams were coming from Crystal's apartment, and thought they also heard some gagging and choking noises. At first, they thought it might have been a sexual S&M game, but the noises continued on for a great deal of time, and they got the impression that they were genuine screams of pain. Susan would describe it as the sound of someone being tortured by continuously being burned with a cigarette butt. However, even though Susan wanted to call the police, Jet did not want to get involved, figuring that it might be a domestic dispute which wasn't their business, so he talked her out of it. Later that day, Jet did tell the building's landlord about the screams and advised him to check it out, but he did not want to get involved either. After Jet and Susan learned about Crystal's death, they finally shared their account of the screaming with the police, but claimed that the officer they spoke to seemed disinterested and dismissive of the murder theory. In fact, he seemed to imply that Crystal was a junkie who died of an overdose, and told them, "Don't you believe she was just sick?" Anton also became suspicious when he found Crystal's camera in her apartment and decided to develop the film which was inside. The last time they saw each other, Anton and Crystal had taken 8 photographs of themselves together, but there was a 9th photo on the roll featuring a man with a mustache sitting at Crystal's table, whom Anton did not recognize. He eventually figured out the identity of the man and gave his name to police, who interviewed him and dismissed him as a suspect. While Anton did not believe that this man was involved in Crystal's death, the fact that the police did not even bother to check Crystal's camera themselves made him question the thoroughness of the investigation. He continually asked for Crystal's autopsy report and was refused on multiple occasions, but finally received a copy from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. It was here that he noticed some very odd discrepancies. The report listed Crystal as 5'7" and 140 pounds, but this was not accurate at all. Only 3 weeks before her death, Crystal had visited a clinic which listed her as 5 feet tall and 105 pounds in their medical records. In addition, Crystal had metal pins and plates in her right ankle from an accident she had suffered 9 years earlier, but the report made no mention of this and stated that her body was tested for foreign objects such as metal, but found nothing. This made Anton wonder if the autopsy report was for the wrong body. In fact, given that the advanced state of decomposition had made Crystal virtually unrecognizable when she was found, Anton even pondered the possibility that the body in Crystal's apartment might not have actually been her. However, investigators would maintain that the discrepancies in the autopsy report were nothing more than clerical errors. They claimed that they ran the body's fingerprints through both county and state files and positively identified her as Crystal. Believe it or not, by the time they did this, the fingerprints were too deteriorated for normal printing, so they actually had to surgically remove them from her body and send them to a lab to make a formal ID. The official explanation for the height and weight discrepancies was that mismeasurements of height can occur when a body is bent or the toes are pointed, and that body weights can be miscalculated by 50 pounds or more when workers fail to account for the weight of movable gurneys. It should be noted that no x-rays or dental records were used to officially identify Crystal, and that the coroner's office failed to keep any tissue samples for further review before her body was cremated. Even though Crystal's body was no longer available, Anton had several other medical experts review Crystal's autopsy, and they concluded that an additional investigation should be performed. One of the experts he consulted was Dr. William Eckert, a renowned forensic pathologist who had worked on the post-mortem of Robert F. Kennedy, and he thought there was a possibility that the exact cause of Crystal's death was strangulation. In spite of this, the Burbank Police Department continued to maintain that they'd already performed a full investigation and found no evidence of murder. They claimed their inquiry revealed that Crystal had a history of alcohol and drug abuse and had threatened suicide in the past. The official autopsy report even contained quotes from Crystal's friends who claimed she was depressed about her situation and had developed a drinking problem, and Crystal's own mother even described her as having a quote-unquote unstable personality. Even though Jet Taylor and Susan Aiken had reported hearing screaming from Crystal's apartment during the early morning hours of May 7th, another neighbor apparently told police they heard the sounds of someone who was violently ill, which started during the day on May 6th and gradually got worse as the night went on. If this was Crystal, then it would lend credence to the idea that she was suffering from a fatal illness. While her exact cause of death was undetermined, a coroner spokesman was quoted as saying that out of the approximately 18,000 deaths investigated in Los Angeles each year, there are about 40 or 50 where it is just impossible to tell how the victim died. However, there was some uncertainty about how sick Crystal really was on May 6th, as she allegedly danced at the Wild Goose that night. Even though the club did not have a record of Crystal signing in for that shift, a waitress friend of hers and the club's security officer did recall her working there on May 6th. Anton continued to believe that a cover-up was being orchestrated for Crystal's death. He claimed that he spoke with a law enforcement official who told him, "Bad things happen to bad girls," and when Anton asked for clarification about that statement, he replied, "You know exactly what I mean," before abruptly hanging up. Crystal's mother filed a lawsuit against the coroner's office over their mistakes with the autopsy report, while Anton filed a suit against the Burbank police on multiple occasions in order to garner access to their files about the case. On each occasion, the courts ruled against Anton, but he made sure to keep Crystal's story in the spotlight, as it was profiled on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in March of 1991 and featured on such TV shows as Hard Copy and A Current Affair. The LA Times published an extensive article on the case in February of 1992, and one of the original detectives on the case, Kevin Kraft, claimed that Anton had accused him of being associated with Japanese organized crime. Well, a few weeks later, the Times published a letter Anton had written to the editor in which he denied ever having said this. It was during this article that Anton named a potential suspect, Horace McKenna, a 300-pound bodybuilder nicknamed Big Mac. McKenna was a former California Highway Patrol officer who was fired from the force and spent time in prison after he was caught passing counterfeit money. After he was released, McKenna became the owner of a bunch of topless bars, one of which was allegedly the Wild Goose. As a convicted felon, McKenna could not legally get a permit to operate these bars, which is why he was not listed on their financial records and was a quote-unquote secret owner who took home a bulk of the profits. McKenna was known for being a very eccentric figure who lived on a 40-acre estate which housed exotic animals like monkeys, wildcats, and an alligator. He also allegedly operated an illegal gambling casino out of a warehouse in Inglewood, and according to a waitress who worked at the Wild Goose, Crystal often spent time there. It was rumored that McKenna often held parties for his friends in law enforcement and used some of the women from his topless bars to entertain them. Anyway, by the time Anton publicly expressed his suspicions against him, McKenna had become the victim of his own unsolved murder. On March 9, 1989, 10 months after Crystal's death, an unknown gunman fired 20 rounds into McKenna while he was parked in his limousine outside his mansion in Bray, California. The crime occurred only hours after court records were unsealed, which revealed that a Los Angeles district attorney was investigating McKenna and his business partner, Michael Woods, for tax fraud. Anton would eventually learn that the FBI had been keeping a file on Crystal, and though they disclosed it to him, 21 pages of documents from the file were withheld. This made Anton suspect that Crystal was working as an informant for the FBI on an investigation into McKenna, which may have put her life in danger. Well, Horace McKenna's murder was finally solved in 2000. It would turn out that McKenna's death was a contract killing orchestrated by his partner, Michael Woods, and another business associate, David Amos, who paid a gunman named John Patrick Sheridan $25,000 to shoot McKenna so that they can take control of his businesses. In exchange for their testimony, Amos and Sheridan each received 20-year sentences for manslaughter, while Woods was convicted and received a sentence of 25 years to life for first-degree murder. Throughout all this, no evidence was ever found to connect Horace McKenna to Crystal Spencer or implicate him in her death. The investigation was never reopened, so the actual circumstances of Crystal's death continue to remain unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So you can definitely draw some parallels between this story and a case I covered on a previous episode several months ago, the 1963 death of Karen Kupsinant. In both cases, the victim was a young woman who was attempting to launch an acting career in Hollywood and seemed to be struggling with their own personal demons before they were discovered dead inside their apartment, and no one could conclusively determine if they were a victim of foul play or not. I guess the biggest difference is that no one ever attempted to link Crystal Spencer's death to John F. Kennedy's assassination, though her autopsy report was examined by someone who worked on the post-mortem for Robert F. Kennedy, so I guess everything did come full circle. Crystal's case is a particularly difficult one to get a handle on, since there is compelling evidence to support both her death being the result of an illness and foul play. Of course, the biggest advocate for Crystal's death being a murder is her boyfriend, Anton Klein, And if you read online discussions about this case, there are a number of people who think there's something off about the guy. He does come across as a bit strange in his interviews, and seems rather snobbish when he describes himself as this cultured individual who took a topless dancer under his wing and introduced her to the finer things in life. There are also a few things about his story which raise some red flags. I think the one part I just can't get a grasp on is the fact that Anton never even attempted to visit Crystal's apartment during the time period he couldn't get a hold of her. He attempts to call her on May 8th and keeps getting a busy signal, and the operator tells him that her phone is off the hook. That seems like something which should raise some major concerns, but according to Anton, Crystal was such a disorderly person that she had a habit of inadvertently leaving her phone off the hook after she used it. But that's still another 5 days which passed before Crystal's body was discovered, and Anton only learned about it after the police called him. He claims that he tried to reach her at the Wild Goose, and was told by the doorman she had left for Japan, which is why he never attempted to visit her apartment. Even so, it's strange that Anton wouldn't have gone to her apartment first before trying to find her at the club. It's also pretty baffling that in spite of all these suspicions about Crystal's death, her body wound up being cremated. But to be fair, I get the impression that the decision to cremate Crystal was made by her family, not Anton, and that it may have been Crystal's wish for her ashes to be scattered beneath the Hollywood sign after she died. Her family maintained that even though they were not allowed to view Crystal's body, they had been assured her death was the result of an illness and had no reason to suspect foul play. It was not until after her ashes were scattered that Anton received information which made him suspect that Crystal was murdered. He showed the autopsy report he received to a number of medical experts, but of course, since exhuming Crystal and allowing them to examine her body was no longer an option, there's no way they could conclusively determine that foul play had taken place. I believe the immediate next of kin is the one who can authorize the cremation of a body, so even if Anton had his suspicions at the outset, I believe Crystal's family would have made the final call about her being cremated, and it might have been out of Anton's hands. Overall, even though I do think some of Anton's actions are a bit strange, I just can't see him being involved in Crystal's death. The Burbank PD were content to write the whole thing off as some sort of illness, and since Crystal's cremation essentially destroyed all potential evidence of foul play, Anton would have been completely in the clear if he had killed her. Yet he is the one publicly insisting that Crystal was murdered, keeping the case in the spotlight, taking her story to TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries, and filing lawsuits in order to garner access to the police files. It just seems awfully brazen for Anton to do this if he was responsible for what happened. To play devil's advocate, if Anton had an ulterior motive, it might have been to help launch his own fledgling career as a screenwriter. Believe it or not, Anton Klein actually has his own page at the Internet Movie Database, which only has one credit. In 1987, a made-for-TV movie was produced called Daniel in the Towers about Simon Rodia, the artist who constructed Los Angeles' Watts Towers. You can actually watch the movie on YouTube, and it stars Michael McKean and a young Sean Harrison, who went on to fame playing Waldo Geraldo Faldo on Family Matters. And yeah, that's probably the only time you'll ever hear a Family Matters reference on this podcast. Anyway, Anton got a story credit on the movie because the script was based partly on his doctoral thesis at UCLA. Because of this, Anton was hoping to become a successful screenwriter himself, but his career never went anywhere. I suppose if Anton was hoping to get himself noticed and potentially land some writing gigs, it would have been in his best interest to keep his face out there by placing himself at the center of a bizarre murder mystery. But regardless of Anton's intentions, I still don't believe he would have gone to the trouble of generating so much publicity for Crystal if he murdered her. So now let's discuss the possibility that there was no murder at all, and Crystal simply died as the result of a serious illness. It seems that Unsolved Mysteries wanted to portray Crystal in the best possible light, as they never made any mention of her substance abuse issues. I'm not entirely sure how serious these issues were at the time of Crystal's death, but since there were only small traces of alcohol and marijuana found in her system, it seems unlikely that she died of an overdose. But there's been some debate about just how sick Crystal was the last time she was seen alive. According to Anton, her case of the flu was nothing more than a bad cold, and she was gradually getting better the last time he spoke with her. But then there's Crystal's final phone conversation with her sister Julie on May 6th, which has been the subject of some controversy. Julie claims that when she refused to provide Crystal with her mother's phone number, Crystal told her that she was so sick that she could hardly make it to the bathroom. Since Crystal's death is believed to have taken place during the early morning hours of May 7th, the police took this exchange as an indication that she was suffering from a serious illness at the time, which soon killed her. However, Julie insists that her sister was a drama queen who often liked to exaggerate things, and believes that Crystal only said she was sick in order to garner sympathy and convince Julie to hand over their mother's phone number. So it seems like context is everything here, but another neighbor apparently told police that they heard the sounds of someone who was violently ill on May 6th, even though neither Anton or Julie thought Crystal sounded that ill during their phone conversations with her. However, the one thing which might discount the idea of Crystal being sick is the possibility that she was working at the Wild Goose that night. Obviously, if Crystal is out there doing topless dancing on stage, her illness couldn't have been so bad that she could, quote-unquote, hardly make it to the bathroom. There seems to be a discrepancy about whether or not Crystal worked on May 6th, as the club's records do not support this, but a waitress friend of hers and the security officer believed that she was there that night. Of course, their memories could simply be faulty, but you could also infer that since a potential suspect in her murder owned the club, he could have fudged the records to make it look like she wasn't working. But we'll get back to him in a little while. For now, let's talk about the loud screams that Crystal's neighbors heard coming from her apartment during the approximate time period she is believed to have died. Now, it goes without saying that Jet Taylor and Susan Aiken are probably two of the least liked people to ever be interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries. Jet Taylor, well, given the circumstances, I have no qualms about poking fun of his name. But Susan Aiken actually has an interesting backstory. I mentioned earlier that she won the Miss America pageant in 1986, and actually has her own Wikipedia page. However, she also has a familial connection to a very infamous crime. In 1964, Susan's father and grandfather were just two of the many people implicated in the racially motivated murders of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, which took place in Neshoba County, Mississippi, and became known as the Mississippi Burning Murders. Even though neither of the Aikens were actually convicted for their alleged roles in the murders, there were quite a few people who did not think a woman from a family associated with such a notorious racially motivated crime should win the Miss America title, especially since Susan once gave an interview in which she said she didn't believe in mixed marriages. But that's beside the point. The issue is that Susan and Jet have taken a lot of heat over the fact that they heard horrific screaming coming from Crystal's apartment and chose to do nothing about it. During an interview, Susan was actually quoted as saying, "We were already told, in California, you just don't get involved in domestic disputes." What is she talking about? Why are you specifically supposed to ignore domestic violence in California? Of course, hindsight is 2020, and they did report these screams to their landlord the following day, who also refused to do anything, so the blame does not just fall on them. However, it is strange that a couple who, quote-unquote, did not want to get involved were willing to appear on camera on national television to share their account. It is horrific to think that Crystal was potentially getting tortured and murdered inside her apartment while her neighbors were electing to ignore it. And even if Crystal wasn't being violently attacked, what if she was suffering from some sort of serious medical problem at that time, and her life could have potentially been saved if someone had called for help? The screams seem to be the one aspect of this case which lend the most credence to the foul play theory, because if Crystal succumbed to some sort of illness, would it really cause her to scream like that for an extended period of time? But as odd as the circumstances of Crystal's death may be, they can still be explained away as some sort of undisclosed medical issue. She was nude from the waist down, and wearing nothing but a t-shirt, but perhaps that's how she normally liked to sleep. Her body was entangled in the telephone cord, but what if her medical issues were so bad that she was attempting to call for help, but collapsed and got tangled in the cord before she could make the call? The fact of the matter is that there were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, and even though the place was a mess, Crystal was known for being a messy person, so that doesn't necessarily mean a violent struggle took place. All that being said, even though the coroner found nothing on Crystal's body to indicate she was the victim of foul play, The autopsy report turned out to be such a screw-up that I'm not sure you can consider any of its conclusions to be reliable. As previously mentioned, Crystal was 5 feet, 105 pounds, while the report listed her as 5'7", 140 pounds, and that is a pretty big discrepancy. Now personally, I have no doubt that the body found in the apartment did belong to Crystal. Some people have pushed forward the idea that the decomposing body of another unidentified young woman was planted there to fake Crystal's death, but I think that's pure nonsense. Believe it or not, the security officer at the Wild Goose openly theorized that Crystal was abducted and being held as a sex slave in Japan, and that the body in her apartment was a decoy. Yeah, I don't think so. I think those discrepancies are simple clerical errors, and the result of the medical examiner doing a very sloppy job. Crystal was positively identified through her fingerprints, so I'm sure her body did go to the morgue, but I have to wonder if the coroner mistakenly mixed up Crystal with another dead body he examined and filled out the wrong information on Crystal's autopsy report. I mean, they attempted to come up with explanations for the wrong height and wrong weight being listed, but that didn't account for why the report made no mention of the metal pins and plates in Crystal's right ankle. So this begs the question, if there were signs of foul play on Crystal's body, could the medical examiner have either A, overlooked it, or B, not mentioned it in the autopsy report because he mixed up her body with someone else? For this reason, I am willing to consider the idea that there might have been something about Crystal's death which pointed to murder and just wasn't recorded, but since her body was cremated, we'll never know. So now let's examine the foul play theory. The one suspect whom Anton Klein has pointed the finger at is Horace McKenna, the currently deceased former CHP officer who was apparently the secret owner of the Wild Goose. But the connection between McKenna and Crystal is a tenuous one at best, and I'm not even sure it was conclusively proven that they both knew each other. All we have is the account of a former waitress friend of Crystal's who claimed that Crystal often frequented McKenna's illegal casino, but this waitress preferred to remain anonymous. As I just stated, I believe that the proposed theory that Crystal was taken to Japan and forced into sex slavery is absurd, and I think that her job opportunity in Japan is not really an essential part of this story. There seems to be a misconception that Crystal had been offered a new job in Japan and was planning to go there, but the impression I've always gotten is that she was being considered for this job at the time of her death, but nothing had been made official yet. That's why I found it odd that Anton assumed the reason he couldn't get a hold of Crystal was because she had chosen to leave for Japan without saying goodbye, even though there's no indication she'd even gotten the job yet. But to be fair, Anton came to this conclusion because the doorman at the Wild Goose told him Crystal went to Japan, which opens up some more questions and makes me wonder if there were people from that club who knew more than they were letting on. There's been confusion about whether Crystal was actually working there on the evening of May 6th, but whatever the case, she wasn't found dead until the 13th. Did Crystal not have any scheduled shifts there that week which she didn't show up for? Did all the other employees just assume that she quit without notice and left for Japan? If Crystal had gone missing, then I can see why people from the club might have incentive to lie and claim she had traveled to a foreign country, but there's really no need to do that if her body is still inside her apartment and is going to be discovered eventually. Again, I'd be really curious to know how well Crystal and Horace McKenna were acquainted. I know there were no signs of forced entry at Crystal's apartment, but that doesn't mean she couldn't have invited someone inside who subsequently killed her. Let's say Crystal really did work her shift at the Wild Goose on the evening of May 6th. If McKenna was there that night, perhaps she invited him back to her place after her shift ended, before things went horribly wrong. Now, be advised, you should take the next piece of information I'm about to share with you with a huge grain of salt, but if you visit the Unsolved Mysteries board at the Sitcoms Online forum, you'll find a lengthy thread about this case featuring a post from 2008 by someone under the username Aussie Rules, who claims to be Crystal Spencer's brother. His theory is that a few years before her death, Crystal attended one of those parties McKenna allegedly held for his friends in law enforcement and became disgusted and vocal when she witnessed some of the men there having sex with underage children. To prevent her from talking, McKenna arranged things so that Crystal was sold a bag of tainted cocaine laced with boric acid, which caused her to eventually suffer a slow, agonizing death via poisoning. Now, I'm certainly not going to take the word of an anonymous internet commenter as gospel, and I'm not saying I necessarily believe that story, but the idea of Crystal somehow being poisoned is not that implausible to me, especially if you believe the account of the neighbor who heard the sounds of her being violently ill in the hours leading up to her death. If Crystal had ingested poison, the symptoms could have conceivably gotten so bad that Crystal eventually reached the point where she was screaming in agony, which would explain the screams Jet and Susan heard during the wee hours of the morning. Crystal soon succumbed to the poison and died, but since there were no signs of violence, the police were inclined to think she succumbed to an illness and had no reason to suspect foul play. I was inclined to disbelieve the idea that Crystal had been poisoned by tainted cocaine, since you'd assume that type of thing would show up on an autopsy. But given all the other mistakes made in Crystal's autopsy report, I could see all the evidence of poisoning being overlooked. However, the main problem with pinning Crystal's death on McKenna is that all these accusations against him seemed to start after he was already dead and no longer around to refute anything. I did some reading up on McKenna, and while it doesn't seem like he was a good guy, and certainly did his fair share of illegal activity, as far as I can tell, he was never officially suspected of any murders. The one thing which does raise my eyebrows a bit is that the FBI kept a file on Crystal, which had 21 pages of documents withheld, as there really doesn't seem to be any reason for her to be involved with them. The FBI was monitoring McKenna's activities at the time of his death, so perhaps Crystal really was working as an informant. I can't help but wonder if things might have turned out differently had the contract killing not been performed to McKenna 10 months after Crystal's death. I'm sure that brought an abrupt end to any FBI investigation into McKenna's activities, and once the focus switched to solving his murder, Crystal might have become an afterthought. If McKenna had lived longer, perhaps a more concrete connection between him and Crystal would have eventually been made. However, here's the big issue. If Horace McKenna was responsible for Crystal's death, what more can really be done? Anton Klein was carrying on this very public crusade to find answers and expressing his suspicions about McKenna, even though he was already dead. Yes, I suppose it's possible that others could have been involved, particularly if someone sold Crystal a poisoned bag of cocaine, but if McKenna was the sole perpetrator, well, you can't prosecute a dead man. At the same time, though, I can understand why Anton would be so determined to see the police files on this case, as the errors in the autopsy report are enough to make one suspicious. But ask yourselves this question: what would be the point of intentionally listing Crystal's height and weight wrong on the autopsy? Unless you believe the absurd theory that someone planted the decomposing body of another woman in Crystal's apartment in order to give off the false impression it was her, I just don't see those discrepancies being anything more than a clerical error. That's not to say I completely dismiss the idea of foul play, as I do think it's possible that Crystal may have been poisoned. The loud screams and strange manner in which Crystal's body were found do lend credence to the idea that she was suffering pretty badly prior to her death. I'm not sure how many standard illnesses could generate that type of reaction, but if she had some sort of deadly poison in her system, that's a different story. But the problem is that any motives for why someone would want to poison Crystal wind up venturing into conspiracy theory territory, and there just really isn't very strong evidence pointing to murder. The alleged prime suspect is a deceased individual who may have owned the place where Crystal worked, but we can't be certain they even met. Since there is no hard evidence that Crystal was poisoned, I am inclined to lean towards Occam's razor and attribute her death to some sort of fatal, undiagnosed illness. The circumstances are so strange that there's no way I would 100% attribute her death to natural causes, but without stronger evidence pointing to a suspect, I just think it's more logical to assume this is how things went down. Sadly, the fact that Crystal's body was cremated ruined any chances of proving foul play had taken place, and short of someone making a full confession to her murder after all these years, I don't think there's any way to conclusively determine the full truth about what happened. But if you happen to have any information on the unexplained death of Crystal Spencer, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Last month, we released a new exclusive bonus episode for our donors in Tiers 2 and 3 about the murder of Kent Heitholt and the wrongful conviction of Ryan Ferguson, and there will be more of these bonus episodes to come, so to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to send a special shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up to support us on Patreon, and they are The Reigns of Yesteryear, Jed F., Dre L., Consuelo M., Brooke A., Kareen H., Mick, and Sarah B. Thank you all so much for your support. And here's one more important piece of news. For the past couple months, you've heard us mention that the Trail Went Cold was planning to appear at an event called Podern Love in New Orleans this summer. Well, sadly, Podern Love has since been cancelled, but in spite of that, the entire Trail Went Cold crew, that's McGill, Vince Nitro, and myself, are still planning to make our scheduled trip to New Orleans and have a vacation down there instead, and if any of our listeners are going to be down there at that time, we'd love to see you. So if anyone listening is planning to be in New Orleans from August 10th to the 12th, please contact us and let us know either by email or on social media or in our Facebook discussion group, and we'll try to organize some sort of meetup. That's from August 10th to the 12th, and we'll keep you posted with more details. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.